Before we really get underway here, I wanted to say a few things about how I'm expecting that you're going to be using these online video lectures. You should not be using them, unfortunately, as a substitute for reading the textbook because I'm not actually going to cover everything that is in the textbook or all the material that you need to know. What I'm trying to do with these lectures is give an additional perspective or add material to what the textbook is already covering. There are some ideas that are especially central or maybe they're especially tricky, and sometimes if I show them from a perspective or in a way that the textbook doesn't, it can help people get a better grasp on them. In other cases, there may be something that I want to add that the textbook doesn't really cover, and so I'm including it here in these video lectures. In either case, you should definitely be reading the textbook material and getting to know it well as watching these lectures. Another important point that I should make is that you should not just try to write down what's on the slides. And you can do that basically with your brain off, as you know. And the point of these lectures is for you to really get to be understanding the concepts. Instead of just writing down what's written on the slides, which will not be enough for you to learn the concepts, try to be actively engaged in taking notes. For example, one thing that I know really works for me is if I try to write down all of the important points in my own words. Or you could try making diagrams that help you understand what's going on. You could try concept mapping. But I really encourage you to do something other than just try to memorize. Memorizing something gives the illusion of knowledge, but what you want to be doing is practicing the art of getting at and understanding the deeper ideas. If you make a habit of that, I mean, it's hard work, but it really does pay off. What I'd like to kick off this lecture on evolution and habitats and niches with is this snail right here. This animal is known as the flat periwinkle, and you'll find it all along rocky shorelines all the way up and down the coast of New England, munching quietly on seaweed, which is how it's pictured here. This is the European green crab. As its name suggests, it's not from around here. Like very many species, it was moved around accidentally by people, and it wound up in the North American eastern seaboard in the 1800s. It liked its new neighborhood, and it started spreading slowly up and down the coast, made it around Cape Cod around 1900 and is now found all the way up into Canada. Crabs like to eat snails, among other things. And a number of years ago, a biologist named Robin Seeley wondered how the arrival of the green crab on the Massachusetts coastline might have changed the flat periwinkles along the coast. She didn't have a time machine, but she did have a collection of periwinkle shells from Appledore Island dating to 1871, before the crabs arrived. She collected some present-day periwinkles from Appledore Island and measured the shells of the present-day snails, and then she compared them to the shells from that collection. What she was looking for, and what she in fact found, was evolution. Evolution is one of the most important concepts in biology. In fact, it's one of the most important concepts in science. One philosopher of science referred to Darwin's understanding of evolution by natural selection as the single best idea anyone has ever had. Another very famous geneticist once said basically that if you don't understand evolution, then nothing in biology makes any sense. And that's an idea of how central the idea of evolution is to biology and how important it is just in general. Unfortunately, evolution is one of the most widely misunderstood ideas in science. And this is true even for people who are relatively well educated. A lot of people have just been educated in a way that means that they're fundamentally confused about exactly how it works. There's a tremendous amount of misconception about the idea of evolution floating around in popular culture, and a lot of it's even taught, the misconceptions that is, are even taught in schools. You don't need to know a tremendous amount about evolution in this class, but getting the basics right is part of being scientifically literate, and it will help you in this course. Since you may have learned some very inaccurate things about evolution and how it works, you may have some misconceptions in your head, and it's really tough to weed out misconceptions and replace them with a more accurate understanding of an idea. So it's especially important as you're watching this lecture to not just passively absorb the information. Reflect on what I'm telling you about how evolution works. Take what you're being shown and compare it actively to the conception that you have in your own head. In other words, put your understanding of evolution to the test. And if you find some place where someone maybe taught evolution to you wrong, be prepared to update that conception of evolution you've got in your head. Be prepared to change it. Let's go back to Robin Seeley and the flat periwinkles on the coast of Massachusetts. It turns out that the main defense that a flat periwinkle has when it's menaced by a predator, like say a green crab, is its shell and how strong its shell is. The thickness of the shell specifically really matters when a flat periwinkle is attacked by a green crab. Thin shells can be pretty easily cracked by the crab, which then just pulls out the meat and eats the snail. Thick shells can resist even the strongest crabs. So for example, Robin Seeley did some experiments. She offered snails with thin shells to crabs, and she's offered some snails with thick shells to crabs. On average, the crabs took about 40 seconds to open up and eat a thin-shelled crab. One of her crabs was able to open and eat a thick-shelled snail after something like 8 minutes. The rest of the crabs simply just gave up trying. So when there's an encounter between a crab and a snail in the wild, the thickness of the shell is a matter of life and death. What I'm going to be showing you next is a simulation of the interaction between crabs and snails. And even though it is run on a computer, and of course is not anything like a real organism, the rules by which the simulation runs are accurate enough. In other words, what you're going to be seeing is legitimately evolution by natural selection. So here's the simulation that I was talking about. You see a bunch of snails just randomly meandering around on a rock. The greener colors are the snails that have the thinner shells, and as you get more into orange or red, those are the snails with thicker shells. Now here's the question. I can drop a simulated crab into this population of snails. When I do that, and this crab starts eating snails, what's going to happen to this group of snails? And more importantly, why? What's the pattern you're going to see over here, and why will that change? I want you to take a moment. I want you to pause this video and take a moment and write down your answer to that question. What will happen in this population of snails when a crab arrives and starts munching on some of these individuals? Okay, hopefully you went ahead and did what I asked you to and wrote down your prediction. Now let's see what actually happens when we let loose a green crab into this population. Add one here, and immediately the crab starts running around eating snails, and notice what's happening. The look of the population is changing. It's changing pretty rapidly, but it's not because any of the snails are changing themselves. So it's not as though any of these green snails suddenly become more yellow in color. Every once in a while I have to make the snails reproduce so that there's some more snails left. I'll stop this carnage for a minute to talk about what's going on here. None of the green snails are becoming yellow snails here. What's happening is that the crab is acting as a filter. It's filtering out those really thin-shelled snails so that over time The only snails that are left are the ones with the thicker shells. That's because it's easier for the crab to eat these green-shelled snails, and so it is going to prefer to go after those first. There are a couple of misconceptions that students often have about evolution by natural selection. One of them is this kind of idea, usually just unconscious idea, that organisms direct their own evolution. And you notice what happened here is none of these organisms directed what happened to them. Okay, the green ones, if they could have directed what happened to them, they would maybe have developed thicker shells, but they didn't. They just got eaten. Okay, neither was it the case that these organisms controlled the way that their offspring evolved. Yellow-shelled snails with these sort of intermediate thick shells tend to have snails with shells of the same thickness. In fact, in this simulation, they have to because there isn't any mutation going on. Okay, but there isn't anything that a snail can do to affect the thickness of its own shell or the thickness of its offspring's shell. All that's happening is that some individuals that have useful traits are being left alive, and those that have traits that are not so useful are not being left alive. And so the population, this whole picture here, changes as a result.